My name is Caldwell and I'm from the University of Stirling. I'm involved in the Living Links project Social Learning and Traditions, but I'm also currently leading a project which is linked to that, and the title of that project is Human Culture as an Evolutionary Adaptation. And what we're interested in that project is really understanding human culture from an evolutionary perspective, because we think it's very important to recognise that culture itself is actually an evolved trait, and culture itself is actually quite adaptive for humans. A lot of the time we see evolution and culture almost as alternative competing explanations for human behaviour. So we see it as a question of it's either our genetic endowment, our evolutionary history, that determines that we behave in a certain way, or it's our cultural experiences. In other words, it's the experiences that we have throughout the course of our life, including our interactions with other people. But in fact, we need to recognise that the cultural capacities that we have, the tendency that we have to learn from others, has itself evolved along with our other behaviours. And so what that means is the behaviours that we learn from others, and also the rules that we use in order to decide what to learn from others, should, generally speaking, point us in the direction of adaptive behaviour. So what we're doing actually links in with some of the research that's going on with the monkeys at Living Links. So for example, with the capuchins and the squirrel monkeys, we're interested in finding out how much they learn from observing each other. So we can present them with little tasks and see if observing a skilled individual will actually facilitate the learning of another monkey. So what we've been doing with human participants is actually somewhat similar. And in fact, we've actually tested some of the visitors at Living Links. So sometimes when we've been asking the monkeys at Living Links a particular question, we've also simultaneously been asking a similar question to the human visitors. So what we've done with some of the Living Links visitors is we've given them simple challenges, but we've also presented them with information about how other people have gone about solving that challenge. So for example, in one of our most recent experiments, what we've asked people to do is actually to build a tower which is made from spaghetti and plasticine. And this is quite a novel challenge to most people. It's not something that they've generally tried before. And that's good from our point of view, because it gives us lots of useful information about how people go about approaching a novel challenge like this. So their goal with the spaghetti and the plasticine is generally simply to build a tower that's as tall as they can possibly make it. But we show them towers that other participants have built. And one of the things that we find with this task is that people do seem to get really useful information from observing the solutions of others. So for one thing, one of the results that we found is that when people take part in this experiment in sequence, so when participants take part one by one, one after the other, what we find is that later participants in this chain who've been able to observe the solutions of previous participants produce better solutions than earlier participants. And this is kind of a simple demonstration of the adaptive value of human culture. Because we can pass on information to others, the kind of pool of knowledge within populations steadily increases, so later generations actually have access to better and more information than earlier ones. And if you just think about some of the technologies and inventions we've got access to now that weren't available even a few years ago, this kind of becomes really clear in the case of human culture. But the other thing that we find with our tasks is that we also find cultural variation that seems to be not so obviously functional. So we find that design traditions emerge within groups of tower builders, but that these design traditions are fairly arbitrary in the sense that it's not obvious why particular aspects of the design have been copied. And again, that seems to be quite reminiscent of human culture, because when we look at the cultures that seem to emerge in different countries, it's not necessarily obvious why, for example, in France they would be happy to eat horse meat but not haggis, and we in Scotland might be happy to eat haggis but not horse meat. It's not necessarily obvious why those particular food choices fit with those particular countries. And we find in our experiments that these same arbitrary choices seem to emerge within groups of participants that we've set up. And one of the other things about the experiments that we run is that we use these quite simple technical challenges. And on the surface of it, they probably seem really relatively trivial and possibly not likely to give us an insight into something as hugely complex as human culture. But actually, some of the value comes from their simplicity, because what we really want to tap into is the question of why at some point in our evolutionary history human culture really took off. Because it seems that from various research that's been done with non-human primates, such as with the capuchins and the squirrel monkeys at living links, we know for sure that non-human primates do learn a lot from one another. But what everyone's agreed on is this is nothing like as complex as human culture. So humans learn much more from one another, and we learn a much wider range of things. So what we're interested in is why exactly is our social learning so different from other primates? So what we're trying to do with some of the challenges that we set our participants is level the playing field somewhat and present them with challenges that aren't so out with the realms of possibility for a non-human primate. So we know, for example, that capuchin monkeys use tools both in the wild and in captivity, and we know that chimpanzees not only use tools but also modify tools so that what they've actually got is absolutely fit for the purpose that they're going to use it for. So those are the kinds of challenges that we want to present to people, because once we've levelled the playing field, so to speak, that'll give us a better insight into what it is that humans are doing that's so different from the non-human primates. And broadly speaking, what we find is that people don't just copy more, but they also copy more selectively. So we're quite clever in knowing what to copy, and that seems to be key to why humans are such a uniquely and impressively cultural species.